Welcome to this Pool Solutions Epoxy Coatings application video. In this video, we will demonstrate the whole process of applying the ProShield 4-layer epoxy on your Marblite, cement or fiberglass swimming pool surface. Please also watch our video on pre-inspection before starting the project. In this video, you can see a Marblite pool before we started with the restoration. The pitting on the Marblite is clearly visible. This is the result after restoration. With proper preparation and following our application guide, you can also restore your swimming pool to its former glory. First, we will prepare the surface by removing the algae, old paint and loose and brittle material from the surface with a grinder using P16 fiber grinding discs. We mount these on 230mm rubber backing discs. The preparation method allows the primer epoxy layer to sufficiently penetrate into the plastered substrate. On fiberglass linings, a finer P36 or even a P60 grit grinding disc may be used to slightly scorch the fiberglass flow coat. We will now proceed to demonstrate the longer method of application. This spans about 3 days. For a shorter method whereby you can apply more epoxy layers on one day, please refer to our written instructions and our DIY webpage. We strongly recommend that you do not perform an acid wash or use chemicals to prepare the surface, because these chemicals will penetrate the surface and need to be thoroughly neutralized and pressure washed from the surface afterwards. If the surface is not neutralized properly, there will be a risk of staining or discoloring of the epoxy coating due to the reaction between the acid or chemicals and the wet epoxy layer. We will now apply the primer layer. When mixing the primer A and primer B components, you can use measuring mugs to measure out the epoxy primer part A and epoxy primer part B in the correct ratio. Mix ratios might change from time to time, so please always refer to the label on the side of the buckets during your project. You can also add all the contents of the primer A and primer B buckets together as applied. If you have more than one applicator that can apply the primer within the workable pot life of the composition. Please note the specifications on the bucket side labels with regards to pot life, drying times, the correct mix ratios for each of the products that were supplied. Mix for approximately 1 minute at medium speed before application. Do not agitate at high speed, as this might warm up the composition and reduce the workable pot life, especially under warm conditions. We recommend using epoxy pile rollers or white mohair rollers for the application. Do not use long pile sheepskin rollers, as this will not offer a good spread rate and may cause shortages of epoxy liquids and an uneven finish. You will also need a few normal paintbrushes. Please note that cleaning roller refills after application is impractical, and you should invest in enough rollers so you can utilize a new roller refill for each layer to be applied. Please note that epoxy pile rollers is available from Pool Solutions, and you can order these rollers with your epoxy liquids. After mixing the primer part A and primer part B components, we start the painting process by cutting in along the bottom of the tiles with a brush. Simultaneously, some applicators can start to coat the rest of the surface using rollers. Now, as you can hear, every job has its perks, and with this outdoor project you can enjoy the sound of the birds in the background, so enjoy. After covering the whole surface, check every 10 minutes for dry spots that may appear where the primer may have been absorbed. Reapply primer to these spots as needed. The whole surface should look wet and saturated when finished. When the primer layer is completed, to obtain an evenly applied layer thickness and prevent paint running, use the same rollers without wetting again and re-roll the whole surface. This will help to ensure an even layer thickness and to help prevent running marks forming in certain areas where you may have applied too thickly. Leave the primer coat for an hour in summer and 2 hours in winter before applying the first top coat layer, which will allow a measure of stiffening of the primer layer and will help to prevent teardrops or running marks forming in the layer while curing. The primer should rather be too wet than too sticky or too dry when you overcoat with a top coat. On large swimming pools, the top coat can even be started with in the deep end as soon as the primer coat has been finished at the shallow end. We advise that you overcoat the primer with the first top coat on the same day while the primer layer is still damp wet to obtain the best possible interlayer binding or chemical fusing between the primer epoxy and the first top coat epoxy layers. It is very important that any layer that was left to harden overnight be sanded by hand using 60 grit sandpaper before applying the next epoxy layer. After applying the primer to the whole surface, we can mix the first top coat and top coat B components together. Start by stirring the contents of the top coat A separately before adding the B component. This is important to ensure that your top coat composition and color stays exactly the same throughout the project. For this swimming pool, we will measure the top coat out in a 2:1 mix ratio. Please keep in mind that mix ratios might change as the supplied product composition may change over time due to new developments, etc. Always check the label on the container to confirm the correct mix ratio of the components supplied. In this instance, we are measuring out approximately 750 milliliter at a time. After the two quantities of top coat A component have been measured out, we add 1 part top coat B curing agent for a 2:1 mix ratio in this case. The reason why we don't just mix all the contents together is because we will then have too much mixed product for a single layer on this size swimming pool. One can expect to cover roughly 12 to 14 square meters per liter of mixed product. Mix the top coat composition for approximately 3 minutes at medium speed before application. We paint the first layer of top coat onto the wet sticky primer after 1 to 2 hours depending on the seasonal daily temperatures. This method will create the strongest possible bond or chemical fusing between the epoxy top coat and the primer layer. For more information on our product's bond strength, please check out our video where we have tested the bond strength of our ProShield Epoxy on Marbolite, fiberglass and concrete surfaces. You do not need to apply the first top coat layer very thickly, and it is normal for this layer to appear somewhat patchy the next day as it has mixed in with the wet primer layer. Trying to apply too thickly on the first coat onto the wet primer might use up more product and you might not be able to apply 2 following top coat layers. If this happens, it's not a problem as long as you used all the products applied for your size swimming pool. The coating thickness will be within specification. Please mind that the surface will be slippery, so take care when walking in the swimming pool. You will have to be steady on your feet or make use of spiked shoes. Spiked shoes and the correct type of rollers can be ordered from Pool Solutions when you order your DIY kit or afterwards. Now this is the following day. Our coating has now cured into a hard finish. We now remove any leaves or water in the pool that accumulated overnight. It is important to sand the whole surface of the pool by hand using 60 grit sandpaper in order to establish a good mechanical bond for the next top coat layer. When applying the second top coat, you will notice that the color now becomes solid and is no longer patchy. You can now apply a little bit thicker than the first coat, but make sure that the paint does not run and leave you with uneven surface properties when the epoxy layer has hardened. Again, you may use the same rollers without wetting them again and re-roll the whole surface to ensure an even spread, and this will also help to prevent paint running marks. Leave the coating to harden overnight. Sand it again the next day before applying the third and final epoxy coat, following the same process as before. After the final coat, 3 days should be allowed for the epoxy to properly cure and develop stain-resistant properties before filling the pool with water again. During the winter or cold weather conditions, this period should be extended to 7 days. The coating will be hard and solid the next day. This is in summertime, and can be entered with bare feet to remove any rainwater, puddles, other objects from the paint layer. During colder conditions, this might only be possible after 2 or even 3 days. Touch and press on the layer in shadowed areas with the fingers to ensure the pool can be entered with bare feet. Sand uneven spots with fine water sandpaper or cut with a blade where necessary to remove any sharp points. Here are 13 important tips to help ensure the success of your epoxy application. Note that these videos are not detailed as the written application instructions. It merely serves as a short overview of the process. The application instructions are thorough and contains everything you need to know. So tip number 1 is always read the written instructions in detail that we have supplied or can be downloaded from our website. Tip number 2, keep an eye on the weather. You are working outside with wet paint. Please visit the South African Weather Bureau website for the weather guessing in your area and for a sometimes totally misleading weather prediction. But in some cases it will help. It is best to paint on sunny days with little wind. For a sometimes more accurate weather prediction, the Weather Underground website also offers an hour-to-hour forecast with radar images of any possible nearing disasters. Tip number 3, paint from the deep end to the shallow end, working from side to side. Especially with the final top coat, this will help to obtain a more even appearance throughout the project, especially when working with dark colors. Starting at one side and working around the circumference might result in a slight color difference at the meeting point where you have started due to the older paint that may have started to cure a bit in the sunny spots. Or if the mixed product wasn't stirred regularly to maintain a homogeneous composition, this can also cause slight color changes when you end up at the starting point again. So rather start at the deep end, paint from one side to the other, and work your way to the steps in the shallow end, and there will be no clear color differences in the coating. As you can imagine, painting the pool from the shallow end to the deep end may of course result in an awkward situation, especially in a very deep swimming pool. Well, I bet you are glad you have watched this video so far. Tip number 4, mix the correct components, that is part A with part B. The epoxy system consists of 2 main products, the primary epoxy and the Topcoat epoxy. The primary epoxy has an A and B component, and the Topcoat epoxy also has a part A and B component. Primer A should be mixed with primer B, and Topcoat A should be mixed with Topcoat B. Do not intermix Topcoat components with primer components. A good idea is to separate the primer A and B components from the Topcoat A and B components before starting the project. This will help to prevent any costly mistakes and possible cross-mixing of the components. Please note that should you accidentally mix Topcoat A with primer B, the paint will not properly cure. Also mix the correct ratios. The mix ratios are displayed on the product buckets. Past feedback from a few other DIY project enthusiasts also indicated that leaving the garden engineer to mix product and apply the epoxy while you are running a few errands in town is generally not a good idea. Tip number 5. Measure out the epoxy part A and part B components in smaller quantities if in doubt of your application speed, or if the area is too small to utilize the full 4 or 5 liter of epoxy liquids. The product has a pot life, and once the two components are combined, it will eventually harden inside the container if not applied quickly enough. During hot temperatures, the primer can set within 20 minutes inside the bucket, normally 45 minutes, and under colder conditions this can be 1 hour. The Topcoat epoxy is a bit more lenient and offers a longer pot life, normally 1 hour or even 1.5 hours under colder conditions. See the labels on the cans for more info on curing times. Tip number 6. Stir the part A components separately before mixing it with the B components when using the Topcoat epoxy. And this allows for a consistent color and curing schedule over the whole pool surface. This is not required if the full contents of both buckets supplied will be utilized in one mixing and application session. However, especially working with darker colors, it is also advisable to quickly stir the mixed components that you have in hand while painting every 5 minutes or so, using a flat paddle to ensure that the heavier components in the epoxy paint does not separate to the bottom of the bucket, which may result in a slight color difference or uneven curing. Tip number 7. Keep the components cool during hot summer temperatures. During summer times, do your mixing under the roof or in the shade. It also helps to do the primer application early in the morning to extend the pot life in the container as you work. During very warm conditions above 28 degrees Celsius, you may even consider placing the bucket in ice or cold water to help extend the pot life a bit. We've had a few cases where clients have mixed all the part A and B components together, left it in the sun or on a warm surface, couldn't apply it all in time, and the product hardened inside the bucket. Now, so they got a nice molded object from that bucket, which is unusable of course in your pool project. But all is not lost. You might utilize the strange object as a door stopper or a small chair for children. And you will of course be the only person with such a unique and wonderful object in your home. But we rather recommend that you mix in smaller quantities and keeping the components as cool as possible under very warm conditions. Tip number 8. Do not place the mixed product down on the warm surface while working. We recommend that the product be applied from a paint bucket with a handle that can be kept in hand during application. Painters tend to conveniently put paint trays down on the paving or on the floor while painting. The thin layer of paint in a shallow tray will quickly absorb heat from the surface, and this will quickly expire the pot life. Tip number 9. Warm up the components during cold winter temperatures under 15 degrees Celsius. Now I know this is confusing. Keeping the stuff in a cool place in summer and warm it up in the winter. But epoxies are a bit temperamental. So that's how it is. Very temperature sensitive. During cold winter days and after storing the product during cold nights, you might find that the part A components that contains the resin part can get quite thick and a bit more difficult, if not impossible, to work with. Well, don't despair, you haven't lost the product. Leave the components in the sun for a day or for a few hours, or you may even warm it up a bit by placing the buckets to be mixed in warm water for 30 to 60 minutes prior to mixing. This will lower the viscosity of the product, making it much easier to work with. Tip number 10. Never paint over wet or damp areas in the pool, and be aware of possible underground water in your area. When you've emptied the pool and started grinding and sanding, keep an eye out for moisture penetrating through the surface, causing wet spots. Allow these wet spots to dry completely. If your pool suffers from severe dampness and water leakage from the outside, you will have to drill a hole through the substrate in several places and drain the water table into the swimming pool until the water levels have resided outside the pool. Then patch these holes afterwards and sand smooth before applying the epoxy over it. If groundwater penetration or substrate moist is a problem in your area, read our instructions on how to treat the surface first and using specialized water blocking products to treat the surface first and to protect your investment. We offer primer products that are specialized and can be applied on slightly damp surfaces. We also have water repellent products which you can use to treat and seal the substrate to help prevent possible reverse osmotic pressure from underground water tables that may cause water bubbles in the painted layer at a later stage. Contact us for more info if necessary. Tip number 11. Always sand any dried and hardened layers before overcoating. The epoxy will set into a hard, glossy surface if left to dry overnight, and the following coating will not stick to it unless you sand the entire pool after each hardened coat. Tip number 12. Do not paint over weak or brittle substrates. In many cases where the marblite or cement has become brittle or sandy, the epoxy will penetrate the surface and harden, but the top surface of the substrate may later crack and break loose underneath the epoxy layer. The epoxy forms a hardened, glossy porcelain-like finish which can't break loose by itself, but it can come off if still attached to a loose or brittle marblite or cement coming loose underneath. Tip number 13. Even when following the quicker method of applying several top coats on one day, consider leaving the final coat for the next day. This will result in a better finish when overcoating on a sanded previous layer. It also offers you a chance to remove irregularities or spots that you do not want into the final coat. It is however possible during warmer conditions to apply the primer layer and all three the top coat layers on one day if you choose to do that. However, during colder weather conditions, we strongly recommend following the longer method as depicted in this video to prevent sagging of the paint layers on the vertical sides, and this might happen overnight while the epoxy takes much longer to cure, and under 10 degrees Celsius the curing process literally comes to a standstill. And that's why the coating might still be a little bit wet the next day, and it also allows for running marks or sagging of the paint if you have applied too thickly and too many layers on one day under colder conditions. Many applicators follow a combination of the faster and longer method, applying the primer and 2 top coats for instance on the same day and leaving the final coat to follow at a later stage. Although ProShield Epoxy is a self-leveling product that will normally smooth out the marks in the wet epoxy automatically, it is always better to leave as little marks as possible, so using smooth soles or extension poles will help to achieve that. Now this concludes our overview of the installation process. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Feel free to contact us should you have any questions or would like to inquire about our products.